Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honour to introduce the Queensland Premier, the Honourable Annastacia Palaszczuk, to provide the first opening address of today's summit. Premier.
Well, good morning, everyone. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to elders past and present, and a big thank you to Marucci for that wonderful, warm welcome to Queensland. Can I, of course, acknowledge our Prime Minister, the Premiers that are here, the Ministers for Women that have come here from right across the nation, but most importantly, can I acknowledge each of our 190 delegates from right across our nation who have ventured to Queensland for this wonderful summit. Welcome to Queensland. It's a pleasure to host you here today. Like me, I know that each and every one of you have policy challenges in your own jurisdictions. But by being here today and as a group of national leaders saying that we have made the prevention of domestic and family violence a priority of the highest order sends a message to the entire country. That message is that domestic and family violence cannot and will not stay in the shadows, that it's not right to turn the other cheek or look the other way, that it's no longer good enough for governments to treat domestic and family violence as a second or third tier issue, and that we will only achieve true change if we all come together, that we can't just rely on individuals or governments or community groups or police to work in isolation and fix this issue on their own. We have a significant task ahead of us, but the challenge is not beyond us. The summit, the first of its kind that we have here today, is more evidence that the national conversation around domestic and family violence has changed. Undoubtedly, it's taken tragedy to bring this issue into the light. Last year here in Queensland, 24-year-old Tara Brown and 49-year-old Karina Locke were killed on consecutive days. The public nature of their deaths stunned our state. Di Manigan, the CEO of Queensland support group DV Connect, said, and I quote, "Queensland got the biggest wake-up of its life. These were two women who were killed in public, and I think historically domestic violence was behind closed doors," end of quote. And she was right. And I'm sure you'll all agree that we are extremely fortunate to have Rosie Batty with us here today. Indeed, the country is fortunate to have someone like Rosie who has the courage to share her story and the vision to create positive change. It was a conversation I had with Rosie that inspired me to bring forward Queensland's trial of Specialist Domestic Violence Court. I remember her clearly saying to me that women get caught up in this legal system, that they have to keep retelling their story time and time again to a different magistrate. In Queensland, we now have a Specialist Domestic Violence Court, which has been operating at Southport on the Gold Coast since September last year. And just 2 months later, we appointed a second magistrate to the court, such as the demand of the court services. It's tragedies like the deaths of Tara and Karina and the extraordinary strength of people like Rosie that have helped change the conversation around domestic and family violence from a whisper to a roar. But as everyone here would know, a change in conversation and an increase in awareness isn't simply the answer. In fact, what it really does is help us to identify the breadth and depth of this problem. When victims hear other victims tell the story, they are empowered. They're empowered to do something, whether it's to save themselves, whether it's to save their kids, or both. In some cases, it can empower friends of victims, people who thought something might not be right with someone close to them, but didn't previously feel comfortable enough to voice their concerns. Whatever the case, one of the biggest challenges is empowering victims to speak up early. Increased awareness does that. Identifying with the stories of other victims does that. We want our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, those living with a disability, and members of our different respective groups, and men experiencing domestic and family violence, all to speak up. And I think what we are seeing now is a flow-on effect from that increased awareness. Over the last 2 financial years, applications for domestic violence orders in Queensland are up 30%. In that same time period, breaches of DVOs are up 42%. And of course, there's a multitude of factors that contribute to this, economic, social and cultural. But as the conversation gets louder, support groups are telling me that victims, particularly women, have the courage to say, enough is enough. And that is a good thing. But as we all know, the increased reporting of incidents undoubtedly means greater pressure on services and an increased call on resources. That as well is a good thing. And it's up to us to make sure the resources are there to give those victims the support that they need. Queensland is fortunate to be well placed on the road to reform. The landmark 2015 report, Not Now, Not Ever, Putting an End to Domestic Violence in Queensland, compiled by Dame Quentin Bryce, made 140 recommendations, 121 of which fell within the responsibility of state government. And we are extremely fortunate to have Quentin not only compile the report, but chair its implementation council. Quentin's body of work and her extraordinary career speaks for itself, but I know the work that she is doing now will leave an incredible legacy here in Queensland, and I'd like to publicly thank her for the extraordinary work that she is doing. Working with Quentin and the implementation panel, along with my Attorney General Yvette Darth and Queensland's first ever Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence, Shannon Fentiman, we have made great progress. To date, we have put into action via legislation or other programs 37 of the recommendations. We are well advanced on a further 78, while the remaining 6 recommendations are ready for action. In Queensland, 4 priority bills have passed through our state parliament, improving our current legal and justice system response to domestic and family violence. We have made non-fatal strangulation a separate offence now under the criminal code, and we know that strangulation is a predictive risk factor in domestic violence, indicating an escalation. Here in Queensland, choking, strangling or suffocating a person is now an offence in its own right, with a maximum penalty of 7 years jail. We've also passed amendments to the Penalties and Sentences Act to make domestic violence an aggravating factor on sentence. And earlier this month, we passed a new raft of laws designed specifically to keep women and children safer. We now require magistrates to issue DVOs for a minimum of 5 years unless there are reasons for a shorter period. Dame Quentin's task force also identified education as central to achieving community change. That is why this year we introduced into our schools the Respectful Relationships Education Program, which is key to promoting a change in attitudes and behaviours and is based on domestic and family violence research and best practice educational approaches. These contemporary curriculum materials have been developed for each year level from prep to year 12. Schools are well positioned to make a difference, and the new curriculum materials centre on self-respect, respect for others and gender equality. We also have simplified the processes faced by police so they can issue more immediate police protection notices to protect women and, for the first time ever, children from fleeing violence. We've increased penalties for perpetrators who breach release conditions or the conditions of a police protection notice. We've made it easier for agencies to share information so they can assess and manage risks a victim may face as a result of domestic violence. And we have provided for the future implementation of automatic recognition of DVOs across Australia under a National Domestic Violence Order scheme. But in terms of bricks and mortar, we have opened 72-hour crisis shelters in Brisbane and Townsville, which have already helped over 1,000 victims escape violence. We are building new shelters in Charters Towers and Roma. And this is an important point because not rural and regional areas are also very important when it comes to providing services for people to escape domestic and family violence. And something I've been keen to focus on here in Queensland is to ensure our response to these challenges is community-wide. I firmly believe the private sector has a big role to play both as employers and as community champions. And one example I'd like to highlight is that of Q Super. Just this week, Q Super CEO Michael Panisi announced funding support for DV Connect. As I mentioned earlier, DV Connect is one of the state's largest DV support services. And when a domestic violence case is in the news, their CEO, Diane Mangan, tells me there is always a dramatic spike in calls asking for help. In this case, it's Q Super answering DV's Connect call for help. Their financial support means an additional staff member who can answer more calls. The other ways employers can help change the culture of domestic and family violence is upping the ante when it comes to supporting their staff. As Queensland's largest employer, my government has chosen to lead by example. Just this year, we've introduced a workplace support package for our employees affected by domestic and family violence. It includes flexible working arrangements, a minimum of 10 days paid leave, workplace safety adjustments and confidential counselling. We've also recently introduced into the Queensland Parliament a bill to provide leave provisions and the right to request flexible work arrangements for those affected by domestic and family violence. When passed, I'll be proud to say that Queensland will be the first state with legislated domestic and family violence leave arrangements for state government employees and local government. And it's something I would like to see rolled out across the nation as a national employment standard. Friends, colleagues, as I'm sure the Prime Minister will attest to, when we first discussed the possibility of a national DV summit, I made it very clear that I would like to host it here in Queensland. I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister agreed to partner with me and for Queensland to host this summit. It's something that's very personal to me. And I'd like to personally thank the Prime Minister for the leadership that he has shown on this very important issue. Having discussed this issue at COAG and with many of you in this room today, I think much has been achieved in recent years. I'm very much looking forward to the showcase session to hear firsthand about specific initiatives being undertaken in different jurisdictions. Today's summit is a chance to listen to each other and to take those learnings back to our own states. While there will be lots to talk about today, we have to turn this talk into action. A lot has already been done, but there is still so much work to do. There is too much at stake here. There are too many people relying on us. Last year, there were 158 deaths related to domestic violence in Australia, not to mention the thousands of other incidents of abuse. On behalf of those victims, I would now like to ask everyone to stand for a minute's silence. Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear of those very significant actions and initiatives occurring here in Queensland.